Transforming suffering. What can we do to transform our deep-rooted seeds of suffering? There are 3 ways to work with them. The first is to focus on sowing and watering our seeds of happiness. We do not work directly with the seeds of suffering, but instead we allow seeds of happiness to transform them. This is indirect transformation. The second way is to practice mindfulness continuously, so that when seeds of suffering arise, we are able to recognize them. Every time they manifest, we bathe them in the light of mindfulness. Our seeds are a field of energy, and mindfulness is also a field of energy. When the seeds are in contact with mindfulness, they will weaken. Mindfulness transforms them. The third way to deal with the afflictions that have been with us since childhood is to deliberately invite them up into our mind consciousness. We invite the sadness, despair, regrets, longings that in the past have been difficult for us to touch, and we sit down and talk with them like old friends. But before we invite them up, we must be sure that the lamp of our mindfulness is lit, and that its light is steady and strong. Acknowledging suffering. Suppose we're practicing walking meditation to get in touch with the wonders of life. But while walking, our mind goes back to an image from childhood, and the feelings of suffering, fear, and despair arise. Now, although we're walking, we're not enjoying our walk. As we walk, we're not in paradise. We're in hell. Suffering is there. The first step is to acknowledge it. Suffering is in me. Breathing in, I know that the feeling of suffering, despair, unhappiness, fear is in me. Breathing out, I embrace the feeling of suffering in me. With mindfulness and concentration, we can go back to the image and know what has made it arise. I have this because I've been in touch with that. With mindfulness and concentration, we can respond to this image with the insight that we are no longer helpless children. We are strong adults, able to protect ourselves. Some of us came here as immigrants. Many of us from Southeast Asia crossed the ocean as boat people to take refuge in the West. During those trips, we were very afraid. We could have drowned at any moment. We could have been killed or injured by sharks or sea pirates. For those of us who took the trip, we still have the images of all these dangers in our consciousness. Now we have reached the other shore. We have been accepted as refugees. We are on solid ground. But sometimes we forget. Sometimes we touch the images of those moments, and we still suffer, even though we're safe. Each time we're in touch with the images, the suffering arises again. This is true even though the suffering may have happened a long time ago. Many of us are still caught in the world of images. The fact is that these are only images. They are not reality anymore. While we breathe in and out mindfully, we can get that wisdom and insight. Suppose we still keep a picture of the ocean where we could have drowned. When we look at the picture, we feel the suffering and the fear. But mindfulness and concentration can bring the insight that this is only a picture. This is not the ocean. We can drown in the ocean, but we can't drown in a picture. So when we're holding the mental formations of despair and suffering, we can look and see that this has been born from that. Suffering is born because we are in touch with an image from the past. The reality is that we are safe, and we have the capacity to enjoy the wonders of life in the present moment. When we recognize that our suffering is based on images instead of current reality, then living happily in the present moment becomes possible right away. That is the power of mindfulness and concentration. Introducing manas. One of the main reasons we avoid our inner child is because we're afraid of suffering. This is because between store and mind consciousness, there's a part of our consciousness called manas that leads us to seek pleasure and avoid suffering. Manas is the basis for our illusory belief that we have a separate self. We suffer because of the discrimination and delusion in the manas. When a fish sees an attractive piece of bait, it has the tendency to bite. It doesn't know that there's a hook hidden inside, and that if it bites the bait, it will be pulled out of the water. With mindfulness, we can become aware of the dangers of constant pleasure-seeking. We can discover the seeds of wisdom in store consciousness in order to help manas transform. This is the job of mind consciousness. The 6 characteristics of manas. Manas has many tendencies. First, it is always interested in seeking pleasure. Second, it tries to avoid suffering. Third, manas ignore the danger of pleasure-seeking. Running after sensual pleasures can destroy our body and mind. If we look deeply into the object of our craving, we can see the danger there. The 4th characteristic of manas is that it ignores the goodness of suffering. Suffering has its own goodness. Each of us needs a certain amount of suffering in order to grow up, to understand, and to cultivate our compassion, joy, and happiness. Our joy and happiness can only be recognized against the background of suffering. If we hadn't suffered from the war, we wouldn't be able to appreciate peace. If we'd never suffered from hunger, we couldn't fully appreciate the bread we're holding. It's wonderful to have something to eat. That kind of happiness is only possible when we know what hunger is. There are dangerous moments in all our lives. When we think of these dangerous moments, we more fully enjoy the safety of this moment. It's because of our suffering that we have a chance to learn understanding and compassion. Through touching and understanding suffering, compassion can arise. I wouldn't want to send my friends and children to a place where there's no suffering, because in such a place they'd have no opportunity to learn to cultivate understanding and compassion. The Buddha said that if we haven't suffered, there's no way we can learn. If the Buddha arrived at full enlightenment, it's because he suffered a lot. We have to come to the Buddha with all our suffering. Suffering is the path. It's through our suffering that we can see the path of enlightenment, compassion, and love. It's by looking deeply into the nature of our sorrow, our pain, our suffering, that we can discover the way out. If we don't know what suffering is, there's no way we can go to the Buddha, and we'll have no chance to touch peace, to touch love. It is exactly because we have suffered that now we have an opportunity to recognize the path leading to liberation, love, and understanding. The tendency to run away from suffering is there in every one of us. We think that by seeking pleasure we'll avoid suffering. But this doesn't work. It stunts our growth and our happiness. Happiness isn't possible without understanding, compassion, and love. And love is not possible if we don't understand our suffering and the other person's suffering. Getting in touch with suffering will help us cultivate compassion and love. Without understanding and love, we can't be happy. We can't make other people happy. We all have the seeds of compassion, forgiveness, joy, and non-fear in us. If we're constantly trying to avoid suffering, there is no way for these seeds to grow. In the upper hamlet of Plum Village, where I live, we have a lotus pond. We know that a lotus can't grow without mud. We need the mud in order to have the lotus. We cannot plant a lotus on marble. The mud plays a vital role in bringing out the lotus. The suffering plays a vital role in bringing understanding and compassion. We have to embrace our suffering and look deeply into it. We can learn a lot from it. When the seed of fear in the depths of our store consciousness comes up on the level of mind consciousness, the practice is to invite the seed of mindfulness to manifest also. Mindfulness helps us to really be there in order to recognize and embrace the suffering and not run away from it. In the beginning, our mindfulness is not strong enough to hold our pain and our sorrow. But as we practice, and especially when we have a community to support our practice, our mindfulness will grow strong enough for us to hold our pain, our sorrow, and our fear. Each of us needs a dose of suffering to cultivate our understanding and compassion. But we don't have to create more suffering. We have more than enough suffering inside us and around us. Mind consciousness is capable of learning by observing suffering and transmitting that knowledge to store consciousness. The fifth characteristic of manas is ignoring the law of moderation. Mind consciousness has to remind manas of the wisdom of moderation. With mindful breathing, we can help our mind consciousness to look deeply, to recognize manas with all its delusion, and to realize that there is the seed of wisdom in store consciousness. When mind consciousness practices concentration, the object of concentration is interbeing, interconnectedness, non-discrimination. If mind consciousness is concentrated on these objects, insight will come surprisingly quickly. The sixth characteristic of manas is that it is always trying to appropriate, own, and possess everything it notices that it wants. Craving is one of our strongest impulses. Because of it, we are filled with jealousy, and we try to possess people and things. But with an awareness of interbeing, we see there's nothing to possess. Transforming manas. With mindfulness, we can transform manas. With mindful breathing, we can help our mind consciousness look deeply to recognize manas with all its delusion, and to realize that there is the seed of wisdom in our store consciousness. When manas is transformed, it becomes the wisdom of non-discrimination, nirvikalpajnana. There is a story that describes non-discrimination very well. It's the story of a grain of salt who wanted to know how salty the ocean water was. I'm a grain of salt. I'm very salty. I wonder if the water in the ocean is as salty as me. A teacher came along and said, "Dear grain of salt, the only way for you to really know the salinity of the ocean water is to jump into it." The grain of salt jumped into the sea and became one with the seawater, and its understanding was perfect. We can't understand someone or something fully until we become one with it. In French, comprendre means to understand. It literally means to pick something up and to become one with it. If we feel separate from something, we can't expect to understand it. The practice of meditation is to look at reality in such a way that the frontier between subject and object will no longer be there. We have to remove the frontier between the inquirer and the object of inquiry. If we want to understand someone, we put ourselves into his skin. In order for friends or families to really understand each other, they need to become each other. The only way to understand fully is to become the object of our understanding. True understanding happens when we dismantle the barrier between the object of understanding and the subject of understanding. Suppose we give something to someone. With the wisdom of non-discrimination, we see that there is no giver and no receiver. If we still think that we're the giver and the other person is the receiver, then that's not perfect giving. We give because the other person is in need of what we're giving, and the act is very natural. If we're really practicing generosity, we won't say, "He's not grateful at all." We won't have these kinds of ideas. If we practice mindfulness, we can begin to recognize the presence of manas within us. If we're aware of the tendencies of manas, we can use mindfulness, concentration, and insight to transform these tendencies and nurture the wisdom of non-discrimination. When we don't run away from our suffering, but we recognize it, embrace it, and look deeply into it, suffering begins to transform, and liberation and enlightenment manifest. In our own life, we need to be able to see what we need for our happiness. We also need to assess the needs of the people in our family, our community, and our society. When we know what is needed, we know what to do. We have an aim, and now we act in ways that help bring enough food, democracy, and freedom to people. When we have our aim, we define our action, the work we have to do to help lead the society in a positive direction. To determine if our action is good or bad, we have to see whether it will lead toward our ultimate vision. The wisdom of non-discrimination. In our store consciousness, there's a seed that can transform manas, the wisdom of non-discrimination. Discrimination between this and that, of this against that, is the foundation of a lot of suffering. It's very important for mind consciousness to recognize the seed of the wisdom of non-discrimination that lies deep in store consciousness and help it to manifest. With the practice of mindful breathing and looking deeply, we will help the wisdom of non-discrimination to manifest. The wisdom of non-discrimination is there in each of us. For example, my right hand invites the bell and writes poetry with a pen. My right hand has the wisdom of non-discrimination. It never tells my left hand, you don't seem to be good at anything. It's I who has written all the poems. It's I who practice calligraphy. No, my right hand never considers herself superior to my left hand. That's why communication and collaboration between the two hands is perfect. There's no feeling of superiority or inferiority, or even of equality. When we compare, we see ourselves as superior, inferior, or as trying to be equal. But with this kind of comparing comes discrimination, and with discrimination comes suffering. The cells in our body collaborate with each other without discrimination. One day my left hand was holding a nail, and my right hand a hammer. I was trying to hang a picture, and I was not very mindful. Instead of pounding on the nail, I pounded on the finger. Right away my right hand put the hammer down and took care of my left hand, as if she were taking care of herself. My left hand didn't get angry at my right hand because she has the wisdom of non-discrimination. My right hand didn't say, "I'm taking care of you, left hand, you have to remember that." My left hand didn't say, "Right hand, you have done me an injustice. I want justice. Give me that hammer." There's no you, no I, no discrimination. They are one. It's like the Trinity. God, the Father, is in God, the Son, and the Holy Spirit is in the Son and in the Father. That is interbeing. In one you can see the other two. There was some pain, but both my hands shared the suffering, because in a loving relationship there is no discrimination. That is equanimity, upeksha. Happiness and suffering are no longer individual matters when the wisdom of non-discrimination is there. Happiness and suffering. With the wisdom of non-discrimination, we can recognize that ill-being and well-being exist inside each other. Usually we think that we've had enough ill-being and that we'd like to have something else, well-being. We'd like to run away from ill-being and go in the direction of well-being. But it is there, in the place of ill-being, that we can find well-being. If we run away from ill-being, we have much less chance of finding well-being. All our happiness has the taste of suffering in it. It's like the flower. When you look deeply into the flower, you see the garbage, the soil, the compost in it. We know that without the compost, the flower cannot be. So touching the flower deeply, you touch the compost inside. Nourishment. One way many of us run away from our suffering is by consuming food or entertainment. We feel so lonely, sad, empty, frustrated, or afraid that we try to fill up that feeling with a movie or a sandwich. That's our way of dealing with the malaise that's deep inside. We want to suppress our pain, despair, anger, and depression. So we listen to music, open the refrigerator to find something to eat, pick up a magazine to read. We consume. Even if a TV show isn't interesting at all, we still watch it. We think anything is better than experiencing the malaise, the ill-being in us. The more we consume, the more we bring into ourselves the toxins of violence, craving, despair, and discrimination. And we make the situation worse. With the energy of mindfulness and concentration, we can look into the nature of our ill-being and identify the source of nourishment that has brought it to us. Nothing can survive without food, not even suffering. No animal or plant can survive without food. In order for our love to survive, we have to feed it. If we don't feed it, or we feed it the wrong kind of nutrients, our love will die. In a short time, our love can turn into hate, Our suffering, our depression also need food to survive. If our depression refuses to go away, it's because we keep feeding it daily. We can look deeply into the source of nutrition that is feeding our suffering. Our suffering will express itself from time to time as a strong emotion pushing us to think, feel, and act in certain ways. If we have identified what feeds our suffering, we can try to cut off this source of nutriment, and it will wither. If we consume violence and suffering, we make ourselves and the people around us suffer more. Ending our consumption of violent images and toxic communication gives us the chance to transform the violence and suffering in us. Understanding and compassion will be born to heal us and to help us heal the people around us. Accepting life as it is. We know that life includes birth and death, sickness and old age. We don't want to grow old, to grow sick, and to die, but life is like that. If we revolt, if we protest, we suffer more. If we accept life and everything that belongs to life, the moments of happiness, joy, and peace, but also sickness, old age, and death, then we don't suffer anymore. So suffering is okay. Not only is suffering okay, but thanks to suffering, we have an opportunity to experience well-being. To overcome fear, we can first start with the awareness that fear is in us. Then, as the second step, we create our intention not to run away from fear. Our tendency is to run away from it because fear is not pleasant. We don't want to live with fear, but fear keeps coming back. We're afraid that something may happen this afternoon or tomorrow. We live with this fear of impermanence. So the second step in transformation is to create the intention to stay where we are, look deeply at our fear and accept it. If we look at our fear and experience it deeply, then we will notice a response to fear. We may respond with confusion or denial, or we can respond with kindness, acceptance, and compassion. This is the response that will bring healing. This is the third step, to respond with insight, because we now know how to bring healing. We don't have to wait for suffering to surprise us. With practice, when our mindfulness is strong and stable, we don't have to wait for the seeds of suffering to arise unexpectedly. We know they're lying there in the basement of our store consciousness. We can invite them up into mind consciousness and shine the light of mindfulness on them. Dealing with suffering is like handling a poisonous snake. We have to learn about the snake, and we ourselves have to grow stronger and more stable in order to handle it without harming ourselves. At the end of this process, we will be ready to confront the snake. If we never confront it, one day it will surprise us, and we will die of a snake bite. The pain we carry in the deep levels of our consciousness is similar. When it grows big and confronts us, there's nothing we can do if we haven't practiced becoming strong and stable in mindfulness. We should only invite our suffering up when we're ready. Then, when it comes, we can safely handle it. To transform our suffering, we don't struggle with it or try to get rid of it. We simply bathe it in the light of our mindfulness.